Take a look at this 18th century topographical drawing of Guanabara Bay. It shows exactly why colonial Rio de Janeiro, flush with gold and sugar, was considered virtually untouchable. To reach the city, any attacking fleet had to squeeze through a massive geographical bottleneck, a channel of water barely 1.5 kilometers wide. Flanking this narrow gap was the sheer granite face of Sugarloaf Mountain, backed by the heavily armed stone fortresses of Santa Cruz and São João. Together, they created a devastating crossfire zone. According to the naval doctrine of the time, sailing wooden ships directly into that concentrated artillery fire was an absolute suicide mission. You would be torn to pieces before you even reached the harbor. But early on the morning of September 12, 1711, the Atlantic approach was blanketed in a heavy, blinding fog. Out of that mist, 18 heavily armed French warships tore through the water, led by the 72-gun ship of the line, La Magnanime. They approached in near total silence. The only sounds were the deep, rhythmic groans of heavy oak hulls and the sharp snap of canvas sails stretched tight against a powerful wind. They weren't planning a long, drawn-out siege. The French intended to break this defensive perimeter by using sheer physics and rigid mathematical discipline to trigger absolute panic among the defenders. This diagram maps the assault's mechanics. The French caught the vento terral, a coastal tailwind. Deploying full sail, they pushed to maximum velocity. Despite the fog, they maintained a strict line-ahead formation. Every ship held exact spacing, sailing as a massive geometric unit. As they hit the bottleneck, the winds began to shred the fog. The Portuguese gunners in the fortresses finally spotted the threat and immediately opened fire. But the Portuguese defense had a fatal mechanical flaw. Heavy 18th century cannons were incredibly slow to aim and fire. Propelled by the vento terral, the French moved too fast for the artillery to track. Round after round splashed harmlessly into the foaming wake right behind the French hulls. The gunners were aiming for where the ships were, but by the time the iron reached the water, the targets were already gone. By engineering a kinetic breach, moving at a velocity that simply outpaced the enemy's reload speed, the French navigated the deadliest choke point on the coast without losing a single vessel. Once inside the bay, the remaining fog burned off entirely. The bright tropical sun revealed the full scope of the invading armada to the city. The French flagship, L'Hélice, bore down in a perfectly straight, unyielding line. Directly in its path sat the Portuguese warships, clustered together in a disorganized, chaotic scramble. Faced with this mechanical, advancing wall of cannons, Portuguese discipline evaporated. Sailors abandoned the heavy labor of hauling up anchors, frantically chopping their own thick hemp cables with axes to get away. Without anchors to hold them or time to set sails properly, the Portuguese ships drifted helplessly on the currents. They slammed violently into local sandbanks, their massive wooden masts shuddering from the impacts. Trapped in the shallows and desperate to prevent their vessels from being captured, the Portuguese crews torched their own decks. The French hadn't even engaged in heavy naval combat yet. The mere sight of their relentless, orderly formation completely shattered the defender's psychology, driving the Portuguese military to destroy itself. That contagion of panic quickly spread from the water to the muddy cobblestone streets of the colonial capital. Governor Castro Moraes and his colonial officials immediately abandoned their posts. Instead of organizing a defense, they prioritized loading carts with personal treasure chests and fled toward the dense Green Mountains. Seeing their leadership run, the local militiamen threw their weapons into the mud and joined the stampede out of the city. Look back at the map to see where the invasion culminated. The 18 French warships dropped their anchors in a mathematically perfect crescent, right on the edge of the defenseless city grade. They opened their gun ports and rolled out their cannons, dominating the entire waterfront with overlapping fields of fire. On one side of the harbor, a tightly controlled, lethal geometry. On the other, a completely disorganized, panicked mass of fleeing civilians and soldiers. But as the sun set over the harbor, it became clear the corsairs hadn't come to occupy the territory. They came to drain it. To spare Rio from a massive naval bombardment, the French demanded an astronomical ransom. They extracted 100 heavy boxes of raw sugar, entire herds of cattle, and 610,000 of these minted gold Portuguese cruzados. French Admiral Duguay-Trouin stood on the heavily laden deck of his flagship, looking out over a completely humiliated and empty capital. By weaponizing strict structural order against human fear, he had forced the surrender of the wealthiest, most heavily fortified harbor in the Americas.